They called me Dust. Not to my face, never quite that. But I heard it in the way the Voreth officers spoke around me, the way their guttural consonants softened into something almost dismissive when they referred to the human cleaning staff. Dust. An irritant. A fine gray film that settled on surfaces and had to be periodically removed. We weren't people to them. We were the residue of a conquered world, and our continued existence was, at best, a minor administrative inconvenience. My name is Marin Solis. I was born in what used to be called Edinburgh on a Tuesday in November in a year before the Voreth came. I have not said that name aloud in 10 years. 10 years of Marin who doesn't exist. 10 years of stooped shoulders and lowered eyes, and the particular shuffle that the Voreth Behavioral Conditioning Unit had determined was appropriate for domestic-class humans. 10 years of waking before dawn in the servant quarters beneath Voreth Citadel 7, the one they'd built into the bones of the old city, rearing up over what had been Calton Hill, and pulling on a gray uniform that smelled of industrial solvent, and moving through the corridors of the enemy's fortress like a shadow. 10 years. I was good at it. I want you to understand that, not just adequate good. I had learned their language in 18 months, which according to my handler was something that took most operatives 4 years. I had learned to read their internal communications by studying the pattern of their claw marks on dispatch tablets, which none of my handlers had known was even possible. I had learned where the senior officers took their evening rest cycles, where the armory intake logs were stored, where the atmospheric scrubbers for the upper residential floors ran hot and where they ran cold, and which Voreth guards were prone to dozing in the hour before their shift change. I knew the Citadel better than its builders. The Voreth built Citadel 7 in phases. The first phase was the subjugation of the site. They used their atmospheric detonators to clear the old buildings on Calton Hill itself, not because the buildings were a military threat, but because the Voreth found it conceptually unacceptable to erect a command installation where something else had previously stood. They were meticulous about that. A conquered landscape needed to look conquered, not merely occupied. The old observatory, the unfinished national monument they'd always called Scotland's disgrace, cleared in a single morning, reduced to rubble they then incorporated into the foundation pour, which I'd always thought had a particular irony to it. The bones of the old world literally built into the base of the new one. The second phase was the structural shell, the vast resin and composite construction that their engineering corps could raise in 8 days if the ground was prepared. I'd read, in one of the technical circulars I wasn't supposed to have access to, but had memorized from a document left unattended on an administrative console, that the Voreth had a specific construction protocol for Class A garrison installations that hadn't changed in 400 years. 400 years of the same architectural template, the same structural logic, the same assumptions about sight lines and defensive positions, and the placement of access hatches. It was the kind of consistency that came from never having had those assumptions seriously challenged. I'd spent 2 years mapping the complete internal layout of Citadel 7, cross-referenced against what I knew of the standard Class A protocol, and finding every place where the specific geology of Calton Hill had forced a deviation from the template. Those deviations were where the interesting things happened. The hatch behind the east heating duct, the partial seal of door 7, the sensor grid gap in the north face supply corridor that persisted because the bedrock in that section made the installation of the standard sensor array geometrically awkward, and the engineering corps had logged the workaround as a temporary measure that had simply never been revisited. Temporary, they'd written that 10 years ago. The Voreth weren't careless. I want to be precise about this, because there's a comfortable story that humans sometimes tell about why the resistance was possible, that the Voreth were arrogant and stupid, and simply failed to take us seriously enough. Some of that is true, but the more important truth is that they were very good at a specific kind of military intelligence, and very bad at a specific kind of intelligence that they had no category for. They could assess force strength, weapons capability, supply logistics, defensive positioning. They could read a battlefield with the precision of a species that had been doing this for centuries. What they couldn't do, what they genuinely didn't have the cognitive architecture to do easily, was read the inside of a room. Not the room itself, the people inside it. The specific weight of a human grief that continues to function under pressure. The particular texture of a kind of patience that doesn't look like patience from the outside, because it looks identical to defeat. The difference between a person who has given up and a person who is waiting. They looked at 43 humans in gray uniforms moving through their fortress with mops and supply kits and lowered eyes, and they saw dust. They didn't see the 43 years of accumulated intelligence. They didn't see the handler network. They didn't see the library that I'd been building inside my own head, catalog after catalog, updated daily, cross-referenced and verified and ready. They never once thought to look. And I had never once in 10 years let any of them know my name. That ended on a Tuesday in November, which felt either like a cruel joke from the universe or a gift, depending on how you looked at it. The morning started the same as every morning. I was up at 4, in the utility corridor before the automated lights had fully cycled, folding a fresh mop cloth with the precise triple crease that head domestic overseer viewership required, and that, if done incorrectly, resulted in a 40-minute corrective lecture about Voreth standards of cleanliness. The utility corridor smelled of ammonia and the faintly sulfuric tinge that clung to everything in the Citadel. Some byproduct of Voreth atmospheric processors that I'd never been able to fully identify. After 10 years, I'd stopped noticing it except in the moments before full wakefulness, when my brain was still cataloging threat signals from sleep. I noticed it then. Around me, the other domestic staff were moving through their own preparations in the dim light. 43 humans in the shift block. I knew all of them. I knew which ones still wept quietly before they slept, which ones had found a way to go numb, which ones were collecting small pieces of information the way a starving person collects crumbs. 3 of the 43 reported to my handler network. I was not supposed to know which 3. I had figured it out within the first year. Priya was at the locker beside mine, braiding her hair in the dark with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She was 41 years old and had been a structural engineer before the Voreth came. She never talked about it. Neither did I. "Commissary level today," she murmured, not looking at me. I know. My assigned route had been altered on the scheduling tablet the night before. I was pulled off the officer residential wing and assigned to the commissary and the adjoining storage access corridors. It was unusual. I had not been assigned to commissary duty in 14 months. "Something's happening up there," Priya said. Her voice was perfectly flat, perfectly deliberately flat. "Something's always happening." She glanced at me then, just briefly. "Different kind of something." I didn't answer. I picked up my supply kit and walked to the corridor mouth to wait for the door lock to cycle. Different kind of something. I'd learned over a decade of this work that there were gradations to that phrase. There was the something of a senior officer arriving unexpectedly from off-world, which meant extra cleaning rotations and a general atmosphere of cold tension in the upper floors. There was the something of supply shortages, which rippled down through the ranks as ill temper and sharpened surveillance. There was the something of an operational deployment, soldiers cycling through in unusual numbers, the armory logs spiking, the commissary running double shifts. This felt like the last one. As I moved through the lower corridor toward the commissary level access hatch, I could feel it in the air, a particular quality of alertness that the Citadel had when the Voreth were mobilizing for something. Their biometrics shifted in ways I'd spent years learning to read. A slight darkening of their neckridge coloration, a change in their movement patterns from the casual territorial swagger they used in their own space to something more clipped and purposeful. Even the guards at the checkpoint leading to the commissary access corridor checked my identity band twice instead of once, which hadn't happened in years. I kept my eyes down, shuffled slightly, folded my mop cloth against my chest with the particular posture of someone whose entire existence is structured around not being noticed. They waved me through. The commissary level was in controlled chaos when I arrived. I'd seen the space in its normal configuration dozens of times, a vast, cathedral-ceiling chamber that the Voreth had converted from the old Edinburgh Waverley Station, the arched Victorian ironwork now buried under their resin cladding, the ghost of it just visible if you knew where to look. Normally, it was a humming, organized operation. Automated supply lines running from the loading bays, Voreth logistics personnel moving in the efficient, slightly aggressive manner of their administrative caste, everything proceeding according to the protocols that kept a garrison citadel fed and equipped. Today, half the normal supply lines were shut down. In their place, a different kind of logistics was in motion. I recognized it because I'd seen it once before, 6 years ago, when the Voreth had launched their eastern sweep. Military supply preparation, not the routine feeding of a garrison force. Something going out, not coming in. My hands kept moving, mop, press, lift. The fundamental rhythm of the domestic class, so deeply ingrained that I could maintain it with 90% of my attention elsewhere. This was the thing about the work. Not just that it was cover, but that it was excellent cover because it was genuinely necessary. The Voreth had standards for their facilities that were, in their own way, almost impressive. Their atmospheric processors created specific condensation patterns on certain surfaces that had to be managed daily. Their building materials, while extraordinarily durable, had a tendency to accumulate particulates from their own atmospheric cycling in ways that required constant attention. They needed the domestic staff. That was the foundation of the whole arrangement and the foundation of why it worked. We were not decoration. We were infrastructure. Infrastructure is invisible. That is the first lesson. I had spent my first year in the Citadel doing nothing except learning to be invisible. Not hiding. The distinction matters. Hiding implies tension, effort, the constant awareness of concealment. Invisibility is different. Invisibility is achieved when you have so thoroughly inhabited the expectations of your observers that they stop actually observing you and simply confirm your presence against the template they've already constructed. The Voreth had a template for domestic-class humans. I had studied that template from my first day and fitted myself into it with the precision of a key cut to a specific lock. The stooped shoulders, the unfocused eyes. The particular way of moving through space that announced, at the level of peripheral vision, nothing important here, and then was forgotten immediately. By the end of the first year, I was genuinely invisible. By the end of the 5th year, I was so deeply inside the template that junior Voreth personnel would sometimes speak freely in my presence about things they would never have said in front of someone they registered as present. This happened not because I'd done anything to encourage it, but because the template had swallowed me so completely that they'd stopped categorizing me as an observer at all. I was furniture. I was atmospheric. I was the sound of water moving through pipes, noticed only in its absence. I had learned things in those moments that I'd never have gotten any other way. The names of operatives in other installations. The internal designations for high command operations that predated their announcement. The specific frustrations and competence gaps of individual Voreth officers, which were more varied than their official protocols suggested and more useful than almost any document I could have read. I began to count. Not obviously. I'd been trained to count in my head while my eyes tracked the middle distance in the unfocused way of someone with nothing on their mind. Crates of nutrient concentrate in the Voreth field ration configuration, 40, 80, more arriving from the loading corridor at the far end. Personal shield generators, the portable type issued to combat units for sustained field operations. Medical resupply in the red-banded containers that indicated their field surgical kits. Weapons crates. I couldn't see the markings from this distance, but the shape and weight distribution of how they were being handled told me they contained secondary arm munitions, the heavy kind used for fortified position assault. This wasn't a patrol deployment. This was a full operational mobilization. I had been watching long enough to know that the Voreth didn't mobilize this heavily without a specific target. In the 6 years since the Eastern Sweep, which had been aimed at the resistance infrastructure in what used to be the Ural mountain range, there hadn't been a deployment of this scale. Something significant had happened, or was about to. I kept mopping. I filed every number, every container type, every observable detail of movement and supply configuration in the ordered catalog that I maintained in the space behind my eyes. Later, if there was a later, I would find a way to transmit it. That was when I saw the Crown tablet. It was on the logistics coordinator's secondary station, which I'd been tasked with cleaning around. The Crown tablet was unmistakable even in its encrypted rest state. A broad, flat interface board displaying the Voreth sigil of high command in a deep amber light, ringed by the 12 interlocking circles that indicated a classified operational order from the War Prime's office directly. In 10 years, I had never been within arm's reach of a Crown tablet. I understood at a cellular level that this was not an accident. Someone had arranged my rotation. Someone in the handler network or above the handler network had seen an opportunity and had put me in position to take it. The realization arrived not as surprise but as a quiet, terrible weight. They were asking me to do something I had never done. Active acquisition, not observation, not memory logging, not the slow, patient gathering of information that I'd been doing for a decade. Actually reaching out and touching the enemy's operational orders. I kept mopping. My heart rate did not spike. I'd trained it out of spiking years ago, because the Voreth medical scanners near the high-security areas could detect human cardiovascular stress responses and flag them for review. My breathing stayed even. My hand stayed steady. I moved 6 inches closer to the station. The logistics coordinator was at the far end of the commissary, in conversation with what I read as a senior combat officer from the insignia on his armor plating. A Voreth who would have to be at least a third-tier commander to be present for this kind of deployment briefing. Their backs were to me. The secondary station's operator had stepped away. I'd clocked where he'd gone, to the far access corridor, and he'd be back in approximately 4 minutes because that was how long the corridor transit took if you moved at a standard Voreth administrative cast pace. 4 minutes. I'd read a Crown tablet before, not touched one, but studied the interface from a distance over a period of 8 months, learning the display logic from what I could see during high command visits to the upper floors. The encoding structure wasn't what most people imagined. It wasn't a single locked file. It was a layered display system where the primary operational data sat beneath a surface authorization screen. The surface screen showed a status summary even in locked mode. It wasn't the full picture, but it was more than nothing. 3 minutes 40 seconds. I was at the station. My left hand held the mop cloth. My right hand touched the edge of the display board in the gesture that, if anyone was watching, looked like the standard wipe-down I'd been performing on every surface in the commissary for the past hour. I read. The amber light of the high command sigil made the text look like it was burning. Operation designation, Gray Stone. Objective, suppression of identified remnant command infrastructure. Coordinates encoded, retrievable by authorized field commanders on deployment. Authorization, War Prime Vasher, 7th cycle of the Voreth Reclamation. Special notation, operational intelligence provided by Asset 11. Identity and location of remnant command leadership confirmed. 3 minutes. I kept reading. The surface summary wasn't comprehensive, but it was enough. The operation had a 48-hour activation window. The mobilization I was watching was the first phase. Whatever they knew, whatever Asset 11 had given them, they were moving on it within 2 days. And then I saw the secondary notation. Tucked into the lower right quadrant of the display, in the smaller administrative text that most observers would have dismissed as routine classification data. It said designation confirmed, Remnant Leadership Target Primary, SOLIS-M. My name. My actual name. Not a code name, not a handler designation. My name, Marin Solis, in the War Prime's operational orders, marked as the primary target of a full Voreth military deployment. For a moment, the commissary ceased to exist. There was only the amber text and the particular quality of silence that exists at the precise moment when a decade of work becomes something else entirely. Then I finished the wipe-down motion, pocketed the mop cloth, picked up my supply kit, and walked toward the far exit at the unhurried pace of a domestic-class human who had nothing on her mind. The handler contact procedure took 40 minutes, longer than it should have, which told me the network was already in a heightened state. They were watching more carefully than usual, running longer verification cycles. I performed 2 full cleaning rotations of the lower access corridor, moved through 2 checkpoint clearances, and eventually arrived at the maintenance access panel behind the east heating duct that had been my communication dead drop for 6 years. The dead drop itself was a piece of engineering that I'd always privately admired. Someone, I never knew who, had designed it to exploit a specific material incompatibility between the Voreth heating conduit cladding and the original building's masonry. The 2 materials expanded and contracted at slightly different rates in response to temperature cycling, creating a microgap that was too small to detect with standard sensor arrays, but large enough to accommodate a chip no bigger than a thumbnail. The gap opened and closed with the heating cycle, reliable, precise, completely invisible to the technology of a species that hadn't thought to look for material incompatibility at the scale of millimeters. Whoever had designed that dead drop understood something important. The best way to hide a thing from a technologically sophisticated adversary is not to use more advanced technology. It's to use the kind of knowledge that only comes from inhabiting a space, from knowing how a building breathes, how its materials respond to temperature, how the 1,000 small structural decisions made a century ago create anomalies that no sensor array will flag because no sensor array was programmed to consider them relevant. That was the entire principle we'd been operating on. The whole decade of it. Behind the panel, a slate-gray chip the size of my thumbnail, the signal chip. I pressed my thumb to it for 3 seconds, released, pressed again twice. The emergency confirmation code, the one I'd been told to use only if the situation required immediate network escalation. I'd never used it before. The act of pressing it was, I don't want to say strange, because strange implies surprise, and I wasn't surprised. I'd known this moment would come in some form at some point. What the decade of waiting produces is not surprise when the thing finally arrives. It produces a specific kind of clarity, the kind that comes from having rehearsed something in your mind so many times that the actual performance feels almost like a continuation of the rehearsal. I pressed the chip and felt the faint warmth of its activation confirm against my thumb, and then I withdrew my hand and closed the panel and walked back to my supply kit. Then I went back to work. They found me 3 hours later. Or rather, the handler found me. I recognized her not by her face but by the particular way she carried her cleaning kit, a slight favoring of the left side that I'd clocked on my first day. She'd been in the domestic rotation for 8 years. I had never known her name. I still didn't. She moved past me in a utility corridor without stopping. Her hand brushed my arm. In it, a paper slip, old-fashioned, the kind that left no electronic trace. 3 words. Tonight, door 7. I put the paper in my mouth and swallowed it. Then I went back to mopping. There is something particular about the hours between a decision and its execution. I've heard people describe it as anxiety, as anticipation, as a kind of suspended time. What I experienced in those 3 hours was something different, a heightening of attention that was almost pleasurable, the way the world becomes briefly and precisely visible when you understand that your relationship to it is about to change. The commissary, which I had cleaned 300 times, looked different. The Vorath logistics coordinator, who I had observed dozens of times, seemed sharper. The detail of his insignia, the specific tilt of his head when he spoke to his staff, the way his secondary arm moved when he was making a decision versus confirming one. I noticed everything, logged everything. Let the whole picture accumulate in the catalog behind my eyes. Old habit, good habit, the only habit I'd ever had that kept me alive. Door 7 was a maintenance access point in the sub-basement, below the Citadel's sensor grid, that the Vorath engineers had never fully incorporated into their security infrastructure, because it dated from the original building's construction and had been partially sealed. Partially. There was a gap, 40 centimeters wide, between the old masonry and the resin cladding the Vorath had installed over it. You had to know it was there to find it. Getting to it required moving through 3 sub-basement corridors that were below the sensor grid but not below the patrol schedule, which meant timing. I'd observed the sub-basement patrol rotation twice, not as part of any planned intelligence operation, just as a consequence of my domestic assignments occasionally taking me to the lowest level maintenance areas. I knew the gap, 7 minutes between the end of one patrol leg and the beginning of the next, reduced to 4 on heightened alert protocols. Tonight, 4 minutes. I moved through it with 30 seconds to spare. 11 people were waiting on the other side. I knew 4 of them by face. The other 7 were strangers, and strangers from outside the Citadel, which meant they'd come in through a method I didn't know existed, which meant the handler network had capabilities I hadn't been told about, which told me something important about how compartmentalized my operation had actually been. The sub-basement space itself was roughly 3 meters by 5, lit by a single chemical light that one of the strangers held against the wall to diffuse it. Old brick on all sides, the real old brick, preoccupation, the smell of cold stone and damp and something underneath it, the particular quality of deep underground air in a city built on layers of itself. My eyes adjusted quickly. After a decade of moving through spaces in near dark, they'd learned to. The man who spoke first was in his 50s, gray-bearded, with the lean, worn look of someone who'd been living rough for a long time. He wore civilian clothing, not the domestic-class uniform, not Vorath-issue anything, just plain dark clothes that could have come from any bombed-out warehouse in the old city. He had the eyes of someone who had made irrevocable decisions and stopped regretting them. Marin Solis, he said, not a question. That depends on who's asking. My name is Fen. He paused, as though deciding how much to give me. I'm Remnant Command, 3rd Echelon. We've been running you for 9 years. 9 years. 1 year in before they even knew I was operational. I filed that detail away. They know my name, I said. Yes. How? Fenn's jaw tightened fractionally. Asset 11 is a Remnant Command officer who was captured 11 months ago. We didn't know the extent of what he'd given them until your signal triggered a review of his interrogation file. A pause. We should have reviewed it sooner. No, I said. You should have reviewed it immediately, but that's a conversation for after. Someone to my left made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. I didn't look to see who. What did he give them? I kept my voice level. Not the name, what else? His knowledge of the handler network structure was limited. He was compartmentalized, same as everyone. He knew your code designation, your location, your general operational function. He didn't know your face or your specific cover identity within the domestic rotation. Fen paused. He also confirmed that you were Remnant Command's highest value intelligence, asset currently operational in the Western Installation Network. Which is why the Crown tablet has a command-wide suppression order. Fen didn't answer, which was answer enough. Operation Grey Stone, I said. You know the outline. We know what you transmitted. Fen leaned forward slightly. What we need is what wasn't on the surface summary. You were at the station for 11 seconds. Did you see anything else? The operation has a 48-hour activation window from the commissary mobilization, which began this morning. The deployment force is sized for a fixed position assault, not a search operation, which means they have a specific location. The field commander on site is at minimum a third-tier officer, which means this is considered a priority target. And the special operational protocols on the Crown tablet's surface summary included a notation I've only seen used once before during the Eastern Sweep. It's a command-wide suppression order, which means they're authorized to destroy the target location rather than capture it. The 11 people in the sub-basement were very quiet. That means they have the location of your central command, I said. Yes, Fen said it flatly, we know. Then you need to move it. We're working on that. He looked at me steadily. We also need you out of this citadel. No. The quiet deepened. Marin. My name being on the Crown tablet doesn't change anything about the value of my position. I've spent 10 years building access to this facility. Whatever they know my name, not my face, not my rotation schedule, not the 43 specific pieces of information I've spent the last 3 months building toward a complete picture of their Western command structure. I met his eyes. If I walk out of here tonight, we lose 10 years of work and gain nothing except one more person in a safe house. If I stay another 48 hours, I can complete what I'm working on and then I'll have something worth leaving for. If you stay and they confirm your identity through biometric sweep. They won't. You can't know that. I know it because I've been in those biometric sweep queues 47 times, and I've studied the detection protocol thoroughly enough to know its parameters. The surface summary named me as a target. That means they have historical biometric data, preoccupation records. My current biometric profile doesn't match those records because the protocol our organization used to alter my physical profile 9 years ago was specifically designed to defeat Voreth historical matching. I paused. Whoever briefed you on my operation didn't brief you on that detail, apparently. Fen stared at me. The physical alteration protocol is documented, I continued, because he needed to understand the reasoning and not just the conclusion. 9 years ago, before I went in, a medical team spent 6 weeks altering every biometric marker the Voreth historical matching system checks: retinal geometry, fingerprint ridge patterns, skeletal density markers in the wrist and jaw. There's no version of their standard identification sweep that connects what they're scanning in the sweep queue to the records they have from preoccupation databases. And if they conduct a non-standard sweep, then I'll have a different problem. But a non-standard sweep requires authorization from a senior intelligence officer and a documented threat justification, and the Voreth intelligence apparatus doesn't process those requests quickly. I've watched the authorization queue on the intelligence office scheduling tablet. The average turnaround is 5 days. You've been watching the intelligence office scheduling tablet. I clean the corridor outside it 3 times a week. Another of those compressed silences. Somewhere in it, one of the 7 strangers shifted weight, and I cataloged the sound without looking, the particular scrape of a boot sole on old brick, the kind of quiet movement that came from someone managing discomfort. 48 hours, I said. I complete the Western Command structure documentation. You get your central command relocated. Then I walk out through the supply intake corridor on the north face during the pre-dawn shift change, and we never have this conversation again. Fenn looked at the people around him. Something passed between them, not words, just the compressed communication of people who'd worked together under pressure for a long time. 24 hours, he said. 36. Another of those compressed silences. 36. I nodded. Then I need to get back before my absence is logged. The next 36 hours were the longest and most ordinary of my life. That sounds wrong, so let me explain what I mean. In spy work, in the kind of long-term embedded operation I'd been running, the extraordinary moments are brief and widely spaced. They are surrounded, on all sides, by the ordinary. The mop and the supply kit and the shuffle and the lowered eyes. The daily rhythms of a conquered person in a conquered world, so thoroughly inhabited that they stop being a performance and become something more complicated. A skin you've grown into so completely that you're not entirely sure what's underneath anymore. My handler, I had started thinking of her as left side, for the favoring of her cleaning kit, passed me twice in those 36 hours. No contact either time. Just the ordinary proximity of two domestic workers crossing paths in a corridor, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times a day in the Citadel's routine functioning. The second time, I was close enough to see that her hands were steady. That told me what I needed to know about the state of the network. They were waiting, but they were not panicking. Good people. I had wondered occasionally over the years what it would feel like to know that the network was watching you. Not watching you the way the Voreth watched, monitoring, surveilling, looking for threat signals, but watching you the way you watch someone who is carrying something for you, with a kind of patient, invested attention. I hadn't known it was happening, and now that I did, I found that it changed the texture of the work slightly. Not the work itself, not what I was doing or how I was doing it, but something in the background hum of it. In those 36 hours, I finished cleaning the commissary level. I completed my documentation of the Western Command structure. The final piece was the communications relay schedule I'd been building a picture of for 11 weeks, and I got it by being in the right corridor at the right time with my eyes in the right place, the way I always got things. The relay schedule itself was a piece of information I'd been circling for 3 months, approaching from different angles like a cartographer mapping a coastline from a distance. The Voreth communications infrastructure in the Western installation network operated on a layered relay system. Encrypted transmissions moving through a sequence of relay points in a timing pattern that varied by operational security protocol. High Command used a different timing pattern than Garrison Command, which used a different pattern than Field Operations. I'd been building a picture of all 3 layers by observing maintenance cycles on the relay infrastructure components I had access to. Cross-referencing those observations against the operational communications, I could infer from the Voreth command staff's visible behavior, and noting the specific timing windows when the garrison's communications activity changed character. The shift from routine to operational traffic that had a distinct signature in how the Voreth signals officers moved through the Citadel. The final piece was a maintenance log I got to see for 40 seconds while performing a cleaning pass on the signals office anteroom. The maintenance tech had left it face up on his desk while he went to deal with a query from a colleague. 40 seconds. I read what I needed and kept moving. 11 weeks of circling and 40 seconds of direct observation, and I had the complete picture. I ate my meals in the domestic staff canteen and listened to the conversations around me and filed away 3 additional pieces of information that I hadn't been looking for but recognized as valuable. I slept for 4 hours, which was more than I usually managed. And I watched the Citadel prepare. The mobilization accelerated on the second day. More Voreth combat personnel cycling through the commissary. The atmospheric processors on the upper floors running at a different pressure setting. I'd learned years ago that this was how they prepared the residential levels for an extended absence of high-ranking officers. The arming protocols I could detect by sound moving through the walls, a specific vibration from the weapons charge-up bays that I'd cataloged in my third year. They were going to hit whatever target they had, hard and soon. I thought about Remnant Command's central location, wherever it was, whatever shape it took. I thought about the people there, scrambling to move 36 hours ahead of a full Voreth military deployment. I thought about Fenn's worn face and his flat eyes and the particular way he'd said the word yes when I'd confirmed what they already knew. I thought about my name in amber light, on the War Prime's crown tablet, listed as the primary target of an operation that had a command-wide suppression designation. I didn't feel afraid exactly. What I felt was something harder to name, a sense of the decades' weight shifting, the long, slow accumulation of quiet days becoming, suddenly, visible as what it had always been, preparation. On the morning of the 36th hour, before the pre-dawn shift change, I laid my uniform on my bunk with the precise folds that head domestic overseer VRath 7 would have approved of. I left my supply kit on the designated shelf. I placed my identity band on the scheduling tablet. Then I walked to the North Face supply intake corridor, and I kept walking. The exfiltration route was not what I'd expected. I'd assumed ground level, some method of moving through the old city's underground infrastructure, the remnants of the rail tunnels and the Victorian sewers that the Voreth had never fully mapped because the human engineers who'd known the complete layouts had mostly died in the first 2 years of the occupation. That was how I would have designed it. Instead, they came from above. I was in the supply intake corridor, 3 minutes past the point where the building's sensor grid had a 30-second gap during the shift change cycle, when the wall to my left simply opened. Not a door. A section of the old stone facade, the real stone beneath the Voreth cladding, that had been prepared as an access point with a precision that must have taken months. Beyond it, cold air, dark sky, the pre-dawn grayness of the city. Fenn wasn't there. The gray-bearded man with the worn face and the flat eyes had sent someone else, a young woman, maybe 25, with the focused quiet of someone who'd grown up in a war and found it the only context she knew. She didn't offer her name. She offered a hand and I took it, and we moved through the old stone opening into the city outside. We crossed half of Edinburgh in the dark. I knew the city. I'd been looking at it from inside the citadel for 10 years, memorizing the Voreth patrol routes from the windows of the upper floors. But there's a difference between knowing a city from above and knowing it from the ground, and for the first 20 minutes I was relearning the difference. The city I'd left at 24, and the city I was moving through now bore the same bones and a different face. The Voreth construction overlaid on the old streets like a second skin, partially healed over, partially still raw. The young woman moved like she'd been doing this for years. No wasted motion. A specific quality of alertness that wasn't tension. She was too experienced for tension, but rather a constant, low-level environmental processing that reminded me, unexpectedly, of myself in the early years of the operation. The way you learn to read a space before you've consciously decided to read it. The way your body processes threat signals before your brain has fully articulated what it's noticed. She was good. Whatever she'd been doing in the field since she was old enough to be doing things in the field, she was good at it. We moved through it without speaking. That was her discipline and I respected it. Communication in the field is noise, and noise is risk. Everything she needed to tell me, she told with her body, a hand gesture at a corner, a slight change of pace when we were approaching a patrol timing gap, a complete stillness she could hold for 40 seconds without any visible effort when we needed to let a drone pass overhead on its fixed route. I watched the drone's undercarriage as it passed. Noted the sensor array configuration, slightly different from the model I'd been observing from the Citadel windows. A newer variant. I filed the difference. Old habit. I had decided, at some point in the previous 36 hours, that the habits were staying. They'd kept me alive. They'd built the archive. There was no version of whatever came next that didn't benefit from continuing to catalog everything I could observe about the world I was moving through. In the pre-dawn dark, with the cold air of the Scottish autumn on my face for the first time in a decade, I cataloged the sensation alongside everything else I'd ever stored. The smell of it, damp stone and river water, and the faint sulfuric tinge from the Voreth processors even out here, though fainter. The sound of it, whined off the firth, somewhere distant, and the low hum of patrol drones on their fixed routes, predictable because I knew their schedules. The specific temperature, cold in the particular way of Scottish mornings in November, the kind of cold that isn't quite sharp but settles into you over time, patient and thorough. I had not felt cold in 10 years. The Citadel's climate systems maintained a constant temperature suited to Voreth physiology, which ran warmer than human comfort. We'd adapted. Everything adapts. The cold felt like something being given back to me. I didn't say that to anyone. We passed through their patrol gaps like water through cracks in stone. The first safe house was a basement in what had been the Stockbridge neighborhood, beneath a building that appeared completely unoccupied. Fenn was there. So was a medical officer who looked at my retinas and took a blood sample and ran me through a brief physical assessment with the efficiency of someone who understood that now was not the time for anything thorough. "You're intact," the medical officer said, which struck me as both the most and least anyone could say. There were other people in the basement, 12, 15, hard to count in the uncertain light. Some of them looked at me with the particular expression I'd seen before in the resistance networks, the one that meant they knew who I was, or knew what I was, in the abstract sense of someone whose operational existence had been a piece of the larger picture they were working toward. Not fame, something more practical, recognition. I sat down on a folding chair and felt, for the first time in 36 hours, the precise weight of my own exhaustion. Fenn sat down across from me. He was holding a mug of something hot, real coffee, or the closest approximation that survival logistics could manage, and he held it out. I took it. "The relocation of Central Command is complete," he said. They moved 72 personnel and the core operational archive in a 22-hour window. "That's fast." It had to be. He watched me. "The Western Command structure documentation you completed. Our analysts pulled the data signal you sent through the dead drop protocol in the early hours. It's comprehensive." "I know what it is." "There's information in there that changes our operational picture significantly. The communications relay schedule alone." "I know." I held the mug in both hands, let the warmth of it settle into my palms. "That's why I needed the extra time." Fenn was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere above us, the city was still dark and still cold and still occupied, and would be for some time. That was the truth of it, and I had never had much patience for pretending otherwise. "They'll know you're gone by now," he said. "Yes." "What do you think they'll do?" I thought about it. The Voreth response protocols for a missing domestic-class human weren't designed for the possibility that the missing human was a priority operational target. They were designed for the mundane categories of absence, accident, illness, the occasional desperate escape attempt that their cordon systems almost always caught. When they ran the biometric search and came up empty, when they scoured the Citadel and found a neatly folded uniform and a supply kit on a shelf, they would eventually have to confront the possibility that the dust they'd been tracking through their own corridors for 10 years had never been dust at all. I wondered what that moment would feel like from the other side of it. "They'll escalate the operational timeline for Gray Stone," I said. "They'll assume the target location has been warned. They'll want to move before any relocation can be completed." "We anticipated that." "And..." Fenn's mouth did something that, on a less exhausted face, might have been a smile. The location they have from Asset 11's intelligence is accurate. Or rather, it was accurate 11 months ago, before Asset 11 was captured. We've had 11 months to prepare that location for exactly what's coming. I set the mug down. You're going to let them hit it, I said. We're going to let them hit a location they believe is our central command, which we have spent 11 months converting into a very carefully designed operational trap. Yes. The basement was quiet. Somewhere in the silence was the sound of the city breathing, the hum of Vorath systems, the distant wind, the particular held-breath quality of a place that had been waiting for something for a long time and was still waiting. The communications relay schedule, I said slowly. The one from the Western Command Structure documentation. Yes. If you have that, you know the exact timing of their strike coordination window. You know when their field commanders receive the final attack authorization signal. You know the relay pathway. We know all of that. Fenn looked at me with the flat eyes of someone who has stopped being surprised by much. We've been waiting for it for 2 years. What you completed in the last 36 hours is the last piece. I thought about what it meant. The relay pathway meant that when the Vorath field commander transmitted the strike authorization signal, that transmission would pass through a sequence of relay points. If those relay points had been compromised, if the signal could be intercepted, delayed, or redirected, then the strike coordination window could be manipulated. The strike force would move. They would hit the location, and what they would find there would not be what they expected. The technical specifics of how you compromise a Vorath communications relay without triggering their encryption validation protocols, that's not my area. But I knew the people in Fenn's network had been working the problem for 2 years, waiting for the relay schedule data I just completed. I knew what the data meant to them the way you know what a key means when you've been staring at a lock for a long time. How many people did you leave in the trap location? I asked. None a beat, it's automated. We cleared it 11 months ago. I exhaled. The automation itself was an elegant piece of work when Fenn explained it. 11 months of preparation, a facility that, from the outside, from the air, from Vorath sensor arrays, looked exactly like what Asset 11's intelligence had described. Internal temperature signatures matching human occupation. Power consumption patterns consistent with an active command installation. Communication traffic, carefully generated, carefully timed, that matched what a remnant command headquarters would produce. None of it real, all of it a performance in the technical sense, a machine producing outputs designed to satisfy the observer's existing expectations. The Vorath had wanted to find a remnant command facility. The facility they'd found, or thought they'd found, had been built specifically to be found, shaped precisely by the intelligence Asset 11 had given them, so completely matching their expectations that confirming the match had felt like confirmation. We'd let them have the intelligence. We just spent 11 months building something to match it. The strike force will take structural and equipment losses, Fenn continued. More importantly, the operational intelligence they used to justify Gray Stone, the intelligence from Asset 11, which includes my name and the operational files that named you as Remnant Command's primary intelligence asset. That intelligence will have led a full Vorath military deployment into a prepared kill box. When Gray Stone fails, Warprime Vasher will have to account for why an operation at this scale, authorized at the highest level, produced nothing. The internal consequences of that, within Vorath High Command, will be significant. I looked at the mug in my hands. The coffee, real coffee or something close enough, had cooled slightly. Outside, the city was beginning its pre-dawn gray. I thought about Asset 11, not with anger, because anger requires a simplicity about people that I'd stopped being capable of years ago. I thought about what it took to give up information under Voreth interrogation, the specific quality of that pressure, and I thought about the 11 months during which the Voreth had been acting on that information, and we had been acting on the fact that they had it. A man breaking under a pressure that would break most people, and a network taking that break and building something from it. Humans do that. That's the specific, peculiar, maddening thing about us. We are given a catastrophe and we start looking for what it gives us. Not always, not everyone, but enough of us enough of the time that it has become something the Voreth genuinely cannot model. They understand catastrophic defeat. They understand gradual attrition. They understand the application of overwhelming force until resistance becomes logistically unsustainable. What they have never managed to understand is the way a human network responds to a leak, the way water responds to a change in gradient. It doesn't stop. It finds a different route, and if the new route happens to run directly through the middle of what your enemy built to stop it, so much the better. I thought about the amber text on the crown tablet, about my name burning in the War Prime's operational orders, about 10 years of dust in mop cloths, and the precise triple crease fold and lowered eyes. I was the justification, I said. You were the centerpiece of the intelligence case for Grey Stone. Asset 11 told them that Marin Solis was Remnant Command's senior intelligence operative embedded in Citadel 7, that her operational archive, if captured, would give them the complete picture of Remnant Command's structure and capabilities. War Prime Vasher authorized a full military deployment to capture you and that archive. And instead, they're going to walk into an empty building wired for their arrival. A very elaborately empty building. Fenn's flat eyes held something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it. With your communications relay data, we can time the trap to the second. I picked up the mug again, held it. Outside, the pre-dawn dark was beginning to lighten at the edges, the particular gray quality of a Scottish morning in November, diffuse and cold, and somehow complete in itself, like the light was simply another form of stone. There's something else, Fenn said. Tell me. Your handler network. The people still inside Citadel 7. Your disappearance will trigger heightened surveillance of all domestic-class personnel. We need to get them out within the next 72 hours, before the post-Grey Stone review consolidates into a formal investigation of the domestic staff. I closed my eyes. 43 people. Priya with her structural engineer's mind and her braided hair and her different kind of something. The 3 I'd identified as network contacts without being told. The 37 who weren't network contacts, who had no idea they'd been living in proximity to an intelligence operation, who had simply survived by the same combination of endurance and compression that survival required. All of them now, caught in the blast radius of the War Prime's operational orders. Give me the exfiltration plan, I said. I'll help you revise it. Fenn reached into his coat and produced a folded document, old-fashioned, no electronic trace. I set down the mug and took it, unfolded it. The pre-dawn light coming through the basement's high, narrow windows was just enough to read by. I began to read. The exfiltration of the domestic staff took 4 days, not 3. It went wrong in the specific ways that things go wrong when you're moving 43 civilians through a citadel on heightened alert after the disappearance of a priority operational target. Too slowly, in pieces, with gaps and near misses, and at least one moment where Priya, who turned out to have known about the handler network the entire time and had simply never told me, had to improvise a cover story in front of a checkpoint officer that she delivered with the flat. Practiced calm of someone who had been doing this for 9 years in the full knowledge that I'd thought I was keeping a secret from her. She told me about it afterward in the second safe house, with what I can only describe as professional satisfaction. You were watching me, she said. I was watching everyone. I know. She was braiding her hair in the light for the first time, not in the dark, and the difference was considerable. So was I. Operation Grey Stone launched on the 39th hour after my disappearance from Citadel 7. The Voreth Strike Force, sized for a fixed-position assault on what they believed was Remnant Command's central facility, hit the target location at 400 hours in what had been the Orkney Islands, in the deep northern reach of Scotland's old geography. I was not there to see it. I learned about it secondhand, in the same fragmented and imprecise way that most operational outcomes are actually experienced, through reports and second-hand accounts, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a network when something significant has happened, and the full shape of it is still assembling. What I understood was this: the strike force found the location. They found what appeared to be an active Remnant Command facility. The 11 months of preparation had been thorough, and they moved against it with the full force authorized by the War Prime's operational orders. The communications relay data I'd compiled meant that Remnant Command's technical team could manipulate the timing of the strike coordination signal by precisely enough to bring the full force inside the outer perimeter before the activation trigger. The trap performed as designed. The after-action reports, which I read in pieces over several weeks as they filtered through the network, indicated that the Voreth High Command's internal review of Grey Stone had focused heavily on the reliability of Asset 11's intelligence, the decision-making process that had authorized such a large deployment on the basis of a single source, and the failure to conduct independent verification before committing operational resources at that scale. War Prime Vasher was not removed from command, but the authority structure around him changed. These things matter. Maybe they don't look like much from a certain angle. One operation, one trap, one shift in the internal politics of an occupying force that still, at the end of that November, controlled most of the northern hemisphere. But the Voreth were a hierarchical species in ways that went deeper than structure, deeper than the chain of command, deeper than the administrative protocols. They were hierarchical in the way they understood the world. Authority cascaded downward from the War Prime like light from a source, and when the War Prime's judgment was seen to have failed, visibly, expensively, in front of the operational record, that light wavered. And a species that has built its understanding of reality around the certainty of its own dominance does not handle the wavering well. I spent the next 3 months helping revise the Remnant Command intelligence infrastructure. Then I spent 6 months in the field, doing work that looked entirely unlike cleaning. Then I came back to what I'm good at. I never went back to Citadel 7. I kept my name. There's a moment I think about sometimes, when the days are long and the work is heavy, and the occupation is still there on the horizon like weather that won't break. It's not the moment I read my name on the crown tablet, though that would be the obvious choice. It's not the moment I walked through the open stone wall into the cold Edinburgh dark. It's earlier. It's the moment in the pre-dawn utility corridor, 4 days before everything, when Priya glanced at me in the dark and said different kind of something, and I said something's always happening, and she didn't answer. Because she knew. She'd known the whole time, and she was waiting the way I was waiting, the way all 43 of us were waiting, the way the entire underside of a conquered world waits, for the kind of something that changes the shape of the thing. The Voreth came to these islands from 30 light-years away. They crossed that distance with a certainty about what they would find, a world of manageable creatures, not yet out of their own gravity well, not yet capable of the coordinated resistance that would make conquest costly. They found a world in the early stages of its own difficult century, and they decided that what they were looking at was dust. I think about what it costs to look at something and see only what it can't do. I think about the particular blindness of an intelligence service that reads a combat deployment and a logistics mobilization and a crown tablet authorization and understands all of it perfectly, and still doesn't understand what it's actually looking at. They called me Dust for 10 years. They named me in the war primes operational orders. They built an entire operation around the premise that capturing me would give them everything they needed to end the remnant command. And in doing all of that, in looking so carefully at what they believed I was, they handed me exactly what I needed to set the whole thing on fire. My name is Marin Solis. I was born in Edinburgh on a Tuesday in November. There can only be one.